going to pick it up in chapter 9. So in chapter 9, Pip has been to Miss Havisham's for the first time. He returns back to the house with Mrs. Joe and Mr. Well, and Joe. I guess we don't call him Mr. Joe. And he is being grilled by Mrs. Joe and Mr. Pumblechook. They're asking him question after question after question, and he's just feeling overwhelmed. Plus, I mean, can you imagine having to describe what he saw there? Plus he's feeling so incredibly distraught that he's so common and he doesn't want to be common. So there's all these feelings, and, you know, kids just do crazy things. And, you know, on account of all of these, you know, feelings, the pressure, everything, he ends up lying to Mrs. Joe and to Pumblechook. So he goes and invents all these crazy lies about what it's like there, and, you know, he talks about there being, you know, dogs and all this stuff, and it was all incredibly made up, okay? Another thing we find here is that Mrs. Joe and Mr. Pumblechook are starting to fill Pip's head with the notion that Miss Havisham intends to, you know, invest in him, that she's going to raise him to a higher social status, that she's going to provide him an education, that she's going to make him a gentleman. And they're basically filling Pip's head with all of these great expectations of wealth and status and privilege, okay? So, for example, on page 63, we have, they had no doubt that Miss Havisham would do something for me. Their doubts related to the form that something would take. My sister stood out for property. Mr. Pumblechook was in favor of a handsome premium for binding me apprentice to some genteel trade, say the corn and seed trade. That's his own trade. For instance, Joe fell into the deepest disgrace with both for offering the bright suggestion that I might only be presented with one of the dogs who had fought for the veal cutlets. And then they totally make fun of him. So as this is carrying on, and Pip then goes and talks to Joe, and he confesses to Joe that he has lied. And again, we witness Joe's incredible humility and morality. And, you know, it's difficult sometimes to follow all of Joe's ramblings, but it's kind of, we know that the sentiment is there. So on page 64, he said, Pip is kind of explaining why he did it or whatever, and he says, I don't know what possessed me, Joe, but I wish you hadn't taught me to call knaves at cards jacks, and I wish my boots weren't so thick nor my hands so coarse. And then I told Joe that I felt very miserable, and that I hadn't been able to explain myself to Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook, who were so rude to me, and that there had been a beautiful young lady at Miss Havisham's who was dreadfully proud, and that she had said I was common, and that I knew I was common, and that I wished I was not common, and that the lies had come of it somehow, though I didn't know how. And Joe says, and as to being common, I don't make it out at all clear. You are uncommon in some things. You're uncommon small. Likewise, you're an uncommon scholar. No, I'm ignorant and backward, Joe. And then he goes on to say a few things, but then this is a beautiful kind of advice that he gives to Pip. Looky here, Pip. This is on page 65, around the middle. Looky here, Pip, at what is said to you by a true friend, which this to you the true friend say. If you can't get to be uncommon through going straight, you will never get to do it through going crooked. So don't tell more on him, Pip, and live well and die happy. So, you know, kind of interesting. Pip despises his heritage, though. He says that, you know, even they are sitting at the table, and he says, Miss Havisham and Estella never sat in a kitchen. We're far above the level of such common doings. And then at the very end, last chapter here, page 66, that was a memorable day to me, for it made great changes in me, but it is the same with any life. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause, you who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron or gold, of thorns or flowers that would never have bound you but for the formation of the first link on one memorable day. This is you know, we already had a memorable day when he met the convict, but now after meeting Miss Havisham, another memorable day. And again, we've got the metaphor of these chains, you know, so he's going to be chained to Miss Havisham in some capacity, and this is going to impact him and his life. It's part of his development is this relationship with Miss Havisham and Estella.